things. Normally we get together on Friday nights and we have spiritual Q&A. We just talk about any questions that come up and try and find answers for those questions, either directly in the biblical text or through application of some biblical principle. We were on vacation for a little while, and then some other things happened, but we're trying to get back into the swing of things now. So again, I've got Zane with me, and we are going to start tonight by talking a little bit about the masks. I've had some people ask me, what do I think about the masks? Should Christians wear them? Do Christians have to wear them? And so that's what we're going to talk about. And I think maybe one of the places where we can find some help on this question of wearing masks will show up in Romans chapter 12 through 14, right? That whole section, Romans chapter 12, 13, and 14. And the reason why we're going to go there is because we're beginning to get some practical application of justification through faith. Paul has been arguing for at least the first 11 chapters or so of that book that we are justified by faith or through faith, not by the things that we do. And then once he kind of makes that big point, he's going to say, since you've been justified by faith, rough paraphrase, then you should do these things, right? And that's chapter 12 and verse 1. You may have heard or may be familiar with Romans chapter 12, verse 1. If you haven't, this is what it says. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. And this is the English Standard Version. And so what he says in the beginning of verse 1 is, I appeal to you, therefore. So those first 11 chapters, he's making this big argument about how we're justified through faith. And then he says, since that's true, I'm appealing to you on the basis of your justification through faith, that you do this thing, right? So by the mercies of God, he says in Romans chapter 12 and verse 1, that's your justification through faith, that you would present your body as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God. And basically, the rest of the book is going to kind of be about that, right? Not entirely, but basically. So chapters 12, 13, and 14 is kind of where we're going to focus when we look at this question tonight. But again, if you happen to be watching, the Hunts are with us. It's good to see y'all. If you happen to be watching and you have questions or comments, please go ahead and throw those up there. We'll do our best to pay attention and get your questions out so that we can discuss them and maybe find biblical answers for them. And if you're just joining us, we're talking about masks, whether Christians should wear them or have to wear them. And in Romans chapter 12, we're to live our life as a sacrifice to God. So basically, if you were making your life a sacrifice to God, what kinds of things does that tell you now about your life? What do you think?
Well, you have to be much more careful about the things that you do, and if you're presenting yourself as a living sacrifice, you need to be good, holy, and acceptable.
Yeah, that's part of it. So now, if you're going to be holy, what does it mean to be holy?
Set apart from.
Set apart, different, right? We can think of if you've ever been to a place and maybe you had a seat, maybe like a baseball game, and you have a ticket and it's got your seat number on it. And you can say, that's my seat, right? That seat is holy. It's yours. Nobody else gets to sit there. You have the ticket. That seat is yours. And so this idea of being holy to the Lord, just like that seat at Minute Maid Park when we went to go watch the Cubs beat the Astros, that seat was yours. Nobody else there could have it, except for any of the Cub fans could take it because we beat you that night. Right? So that's yours. You then, as a living sacrifice, are set apart just for God. So your life now is no longer yours, but you're living your life for the Lord, if you're doing what he says here in chapter 12. So to start off, when we start asking, do I have to wear a mask? That may not be exactly the right question to ask, but it might be part of the question. But what kind of thing should I be doing as a believer if my life now is dedicated to the Lord? What will most display a life that is dedicated to the Lord? And so that's really what we're concerned really with any question that might come up. What kind of response, what kind of answer would show that my life is dedicated to the Lord? Now, when you're at home, I don't really think that people feel like they have to wear masks at home necessarily. There might be some circumstances, but generally speaking, the loving answer is probably going to be the one that most reflects a life that is dedicated entirely to the Lord. Because Jesus would say over in John chapter 13, do you remember what he said there?
No.
No, it's okay if you don't. We'll read it. We'll come right back to Romans 12. So John chapter 13, over in verse 34, he's going to say, a new commandment I give you, that you love one another. It's John 13, verse 34. Just as I have loved you, you are to love one another. And by this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. Right, so if we're thinking about our lives as being set apart for the Lord, then a life that is set apart from the Lord is going to look like what?
It's going to look holy.
Based off what we just read. You're right.
You're going to love other people.
You're going to love other people the way that Jesus did, the way he sacrificed himself, the way he gave up his rights for others. That's an important thing. He gave up his rights. And so when it comes to this question of wearing a mask, it's really not a question of what are my rights, right? Do I have the right to not wear a mask? I mean, if you do have the right to not wear one legally, then at least as far as the law is concerned, you might not have to wear one. But we're not really concerned with human laws. I mean, we are some. That's why we're going to look at Romans 13 too. We're mostly concerned with this divine law, this rule, this law of love. If our life is set apart for God, holy, acceptable, perfectly to the Lord, then it's going to be a life that is full of love for other people, right? So that's what we're going to kind of use as the foundation for what should we do. And so what that does is it makes this not a political question. This is not a political question. When we ask the question, do I have to wear a mask? Really, from a Christian perspective, it's not a political question. Right? It's not that you support one party if you do and another party if you don't. It has nothing to do with that from a believer's perspective. It shouldn't. We are approaching this from a higher plane. We are approaching this from a divine perspective, knowing that our citizenship is in heaven. Right? We might live here temporarily, but really our citizenship, our home is with the Lord. Right? We're not necessarily talking about a place, but we're talking about who we belong to. And so ultimately, we are looking for a bigger answer than just what does the law say. So that's kind of the benchmark, is we're going to look for a life that is lived according to love. Now, the first thing, the easy answer, would be that if you live somewhere and they have a mask law, should Christians obey the law?
Yes.
Which laws?
All of them that are not keeping you from serving the Lord in the right way.
Yeah, you should obey all the laws, right? All of them. All the ones that you can. What about the silly ones? Like what if we live in Nashville? What if the governor or the mayor in Nashville, the governor of Tennessee, yeah, there you go. What if the governor said that there's a new law that you have to eat cabbage on Thursdays?
Guess we'd be
eating cabbage on Thursdays. Yeah. It doesn't matter how silly it is. You're a believer, so you should be willing to follow those in authority. And now there's kind of a little twist to this. We would follow that law, not because it was the law necessarily, but because the people in power are the ones that we show respect to, and they're the ones who tell us to eat cabbage. Right? And so this is important in the discussion, because a lot of people want to reject wearing a mask by saying, oh, well, I have a constitutional right, so I don't have to do that. But it's interesting, and this is why we're doing Romans 12, 13, and 14. And I think we talked a little bit about this the last time we had a questions class. Because when you look in Romans chapter 13, Paul does not say in this argument, make sure and be submissive to documents. Right? And I'm not saying that there are no documents.
Yeah. Right?
Because the law of Moses existed, and you kind of argue that that's a document, even though it's not really, but kind of. It's on tablets and all that. Anyway, it's not kind of a different thing than like a legal code, like a codified law system for a nation, even though it did service anyway, minutia. So over here in Romans chapter 13, he says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. He's really talking about people, not documents. Right? So there might be, like maybe the governor is going to violate some law. In some countries, you don't get to appeal to the government. You don't get to say, hey, I don't think that we're doing things the right way. You just have to do what the leaders tell you, or you're going to be in trouble. And so it really doesn't matter what the laws are necessarily. It matters what the governing authorities allow. Now, in our country, I think we have it's the most liberal country, one of the most liberal countries in the world, as far as freedoms are concerned. And you have the freedom to redress your grievances, right? To go before the governing authorities and say, hey, I don't think this is right. And so you can do that in our country, but there's a process that's involved in that. You can't just disobey because you think you can, right? Not from a believer's perspective. From a believer's perspective, our tendency should be to do what? To rebel or obey? To obey, right? And so if you live in a place where there is a mask law, some kind of executive order, some kind of ordinance, some kind of mandate, whatever, what should you do if you're a believer?
Obey it.
You should obey it. Why?
Because it's what we're called to do, to respect the governing authority.
Right, to respect the people who are in charge. And if the governor of your state says, hey, you should wear masks, then as a believer, I feel compelled to do that. Not because I agree, not because I think that it's the perfect solution, not because I think there's no problems. None of that stuff really enters into the equation. I'm a believer, a disciple of Jesus Christ, and he calls me to obey the people in power. And the person who is in power told me to wear a mask. So guess what I'm doing?
Wear a mask.
Going to wear a mask, right? So if you live in a place where the governing authorities have told you to wear a mask, then this is an easy question. You wear the mask. And you do it joyfully, because really you're serving the Lord by being obedient to those governing authorities. So what if you live in a place where it's not required? Like for a while in Tennessee, where we live at least, you didn't have to wear it, but they really wanted you to. So what would be the right thing to do then?
Go ahead and wear one anyway.
Probably. Why?
Because you're still respecting the authority, even though you aren't. You better do this, but it's still showing respect to the authorities.
I would agree. Right? If the governor of your state, or the mayor of your town, or the sheriff of your county, whatever, right? Whatever kind of system you've got where you live locally, if they were to come and say, hey, I would really like for you to do this, what does it say about our obedience to those governing authorities if it requires a law for us to do what they say? Are we really being submissive to being subject to those governing authorities? Or are we going to force them to make us do things? Right? And so it comes down to that kind of question, is what is the attitude of a believer? Is a believer only going to obey if the government is actually going to force me to obey? Or is a believer going to obey because it's the right thing to do? And that's a difficult question. I think that based on the text that we have in Romans chapter 13, the thing to do would be to listen. Even if there's no mandate, right, that you have to do this or you're going to be in trouble. If a governing authority were to say, hey, will you please do this? Then as a believer, you should be like, I really don't want to, but I will. Right? And that seems to be the overall attitude of believers, or at least the instructions given to believers in Romans chapter 13. Right? So now kind of going back to Romans 12, there's some other things that are said that I think are really interesting. So we're going to read again for a little bit. We're going to look in Romans chapter 12, verse 3. He says, for by the grace, oh, that's my wife contacting me. I don't know where my phone is. There we go. Where was I? Romans 12:3. Romans chapter 12, verse 3. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. So we do need to be thinking about these things, the sober judgment part. But the way that we're thinking about these is not thinking highly of myself. I have these rights, I have these privileges, but to carefully, with sober judgment, right? Carefully thinking about how my actions show the rest of the world. What do my actions show the rest of the world about Christ? Well, what do my actions show the world about the love of Christ? That's the important thing. Not defending my rights, not defending any privileges that I might have being part of a certain society or culture or nation, but what can I do to show that my life is a living sacrifice to the Lord? So let's keep reading. For as in one body we have many members, and the members do not all have the same function. So we, though many, are one body in Christ and individually members of one another, right? So what I do affects other people, and what other people do affects me, right? That's this love for one another kind of that we're seeing. We are all part of this body together. And he's going to talk about how we have different gifts, and there are different things that we do, and we're all working together so that we can have this sober judgment, and we can come to good biblical conclusions. And then in verse 9, he's going to tell us some new things or some additional things. Let love be genuine. In other words, really love people. And so let's focus on that for just a second. Let love be genuine. If I love you and I know that I could be carrying a sickness asymptomatically, so without symptoms, and I might pass that on to you, what would be the loving thing to do?
Wear a mask.
Try and prevent it.
Stay away from it.
Yeah, stay away from it, right? So if I was exposed to somebody who we know had the coronavirus, what would be the loving thing to do?
Stay home, self-quarantine.
To quarantine, right, for 14 days or whatever the doctors say. Right, that's the loving thing to do. Do you have to do that? I mean, is someone going to hit you in the head and force you? I mean, it depends on where you live, right? There might be laws, there might be rules. But the loving thing to do would be to do that without having the law. I don't want to hurt you. And I was in a situation where I may have this sickness, and now if I could have it and not know it, and I don't want to spread it to you or maybe spread it to other people. Anyway, so I'm just going to stay home for a little while. Not because I'm afraid, but because I love you. And I don't want to hurt you. So now if you take that same concept and you apply that to the masks, well, why do you wear a mask at all? What's the point of wearing the mask?
Protection.
For whom?
Everyone.
For other people, actually, right? So that if I have it and I don't know it and I sneeze or do whatever, cough, right, it goes into the mask and it keeps it from spreading quite so far. That's why you wear it, is to try and protect other people because you love them. Not because you have to do it, not because there's a rule or a law, but because we're showing this genuine love for other people. And so I would argue that that's why you wear it. Not because it's constitutional or unconstitutional, not because of the Republicans or the Democrats or the Libertarians or the Green Party or whatever, not because Canada did it first. Who cares, right? None of those things. It's because I love people and I want to help people and I want to be kind to other people. And me insisting on my rights when exercising those rights could cause harm, well, we have to consider that, right? And there's no perfect scenario because you can look at things like driving a car, right? There's risk involved in everything. Anytime you go in public, there's going to be risk. But when I drive a car, I try to drive that car as safely as possible. I obey the speed limits. I follow the traffic laws. I wear my seatbelt. You can't ride in my car if you're not wearing your seatbelt, right? I want people to do it as safely as possible. And so going out in public, I don't think there's a way that we can eliminate all the risk. That's silly. But there is a way that we can eliminate some of the risk. Masks is one of those ways. Wearing gloves, washing your hands, being careful not to lick things, right? So, I mean, just all these different ways. We're trying to show love. So another thing he's going to say is a little bit further down in the text. It's verse 17, actually. He's going to say, repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. Right? So we're not interested in making sure that people suffer or get what they deserve. That's not what we're after. We're after in making sure that we try and do the right thing in everybody's eyes. Right? So let's just assume, let's make the case that in 3 months we find out, or in 6 months we find out that everything concerning the coronavirus was all just big hype. And it was not a big deal. Would it be better to have been a little more cautious and wear a mask, or to not have worn a mask at all and wind up being right at the end?
It would have been better to wear them the whole time.
Probably. But now let's flip that. In 6 months, we find out that this is all worse than we thought. And for 6 months, I've gone around not wearing my mask because I have rights. And maybe I have unknowingly infected other people and they've died because of it. Which would be better then, to have worn the mask or to not?
Wear the mask.
I think when you look at it, again, with that sober judgment that we see up in verse 3, this careful consideration of what God has said, of what it means for my life to be a living sacrifice, it seems like the thing to do would be to just wear the mask, even if there's not a law. Not because of politics, not because of any of the reasons that people are offering. And I'm not worried about my rights. I'm not worried about my liberties, because again, pretend there's no law, right? The thing to do, that now that we know that this is here, the thing to do would be to be as careful as possible around others so that you don't cause harm. And now, as we learn new things, the best thing to do might change. But that's kind of what we're interested in right now. And so it's not political, it's biblical. How do I show love to other people? How do I show consideration to other people? How do I show the type of willingness to sacrifice myself for other people? How do I become this living sacrifice? And it seems like with the mask question, the answer is just to wear the mask. Even if you don't believe anything, even if you think it's all just a bunch of hype, even if you think it's just the flu, I'm going to go out and say, maybe we should just wear masks during flu season too, please, because I hate the flu. I don't want to catch it. Everybody wear masks and get vaccinated. Anyway, it just seems to be the prudent, the considerate, the honorable in the sight of all people type thing to do. What do you think? Any other thoughts? Anything to add to that?
You got it all.
I got it all? I don't think I got it all. But I think that's a good place to start, at least begin the conversation, is that this is just the loving thing to do. And I think that's the way that believers, the way that Christians should approach almost every question. What is the loving thing to do here? How do I show the love of Christ in my actions? Did you have any other questions or anything else you want to talk about? Any other thoughts about even the masks?
No, sir.
None at all? No thoughts about the masks?
Not at the moment, no.
Okay, well, if you're watching and you have comments or questions, go ahead and throw them out there. And even if you disagree, I'm not saying that you're not loving if you disagree. I would just want to hear how you feel like not wearing a mask is the more loving thing to do. And that would be a good conversation to have. Because in this discussion, right, we're not setting out to accuse anybody of not being loving or not loving God. We're trying to find what is the most loving thing to do. What is the best way to show love to other people? And so it's not even really a discussion about who's right and who's wrong. It's a discussion about what's the best. Right? What is the best way to do this? Did you have any other questions about any other biblical topics?
No, sir.
What did I bring you on here for? Oh, it's you're handsome. It's your good looks. That's what it was.
You're supposed to nod and say yes.
Nod and say yes and smile at the camera.
Yeah.
At the camera. Oh. Smile at the camera. Come over here and smile at the camera. The camera's up there. Hi, Mom. All right. Well, we're not going to keep talking just to talk. So if that's all I had planned. If you don't have any questions, then we'll be finished.
That's all I got.
Okay. Next week, we will talk about why I'm stronger than Zane and better looking. But that's next week's discussion. Again, any comments? I'd like to keep the discussion going maybe throughout the week or the weekend. And especially if you disagree, how we can find the best way to show that love or to be a living sacrifice for others. So we'll just leave it there. And at any time, if you have any questions, you can either text them to me if you know my phone number, or email them to me if you know my email. And if you don't know any of those things, you can always just send me a message on Facebook, or you can just comment on any of the other past videos that we've done. And I'll do my best to get to your questions, because that's what we want to do. We just want to find answers from the Bible to the questions that we have about religion and spirituality and even philosophy, where the Bible touches on those things. So God bless you. Thank you for joining us. And we'll be back same time next week.